Well, good morning, everyone. My name is David Bobzien. I'm the Director of the Governor's Office of Energy in Nevada. Very much appreciated hearing the Maine perspective. I think it was a great table set for our proceedings for today and tomorrow. Particularly very happy, as all of us are, I think, to be back again in person. As Dan mentioned, used to seeing so many of you on Zoom squares, and so it's good to catch up with folks. It was great to see people last night. Hope everyone had a good time with their dinners and socializing. And I think kind of continuing the general, what has everyone been doing over the last year and a half discussion, we have this panel this morning where we're going to kind of, now that we've heard from Maine, zoom back out and hear some perspectives from the different states as to what's been happening since we've all been apart. Particularly when it comes to climate with our programs, and also I think with this emerging on the scene and very much centered conversation around equity. I certainly think that from the Nevada perspective, the pandemic has revealed a lot of things, and no doubt about it, equity and disparities in society have certainly been laid bare. I think it's a double whammy with COVID and air quality for us in Nevada from last summer because of the very much on everyone's minds climate impacts of wildfires that we've had in the West. In Nevada alone, this year we had, in Reno, we had 63 smoke event days with air quality index for PM 2.5 being in unhealthy ranges. I want to say, lost track as a parent, our school district closed schools at least 3 days, I believe, this year, just because of air quality problems. And of course, those 63 smoke days, that broke our previously set record in 2020 of 59 smoke days. So we've gotten to the point in northern Nevada where half of our summer is now spent indoors behind our MERV 13 air conditioning filters, which is not fun, but I guess the kids enjoy playing the video games when they should be outside. But just to kind of kick this off, and I'm the moderator, so I shouldn't be talking. The presenters need to be talking. They'll give their updates. But during the pandemic, our climate work in Nevada continued. We certainly heard the great strides that have been made in Maine with their planning. We had a similar effort that started with an executive order from our governor in 2019, setting targets for GHG reduction and instructing the administration to put together a climate strategy. We went into 2020 with very robust plans for full community engagement, meeting people where they were, making sure that everyone was at the table and that we were going to them. And then the next thing you know, we had to shift and go to a virtual format. But nonetheless, we did that. We got through 2020. We engaged various communities in all kinds of virtual meetings and did produce at the end of 2020 our climate strategy. And for my office, a lot of our work now is rolled up into that strategy. But so many things happening in Nevada. We have a renewable energy tax abatement program that supports utility scale renewable projects, primarily solar, if you think of Nevada, but we're now shifting into rulemaking for storage projects with that. Thanks to, in a lot of ways, NASEO's support for our office's work on building codes, we were able to retire during our last legislative session, our green building tax abatement program. If you can think of the Las Vegas skyline and just how much abated taxes there had been in the last decade, we were very happy to put that to rest because codes have gotten to a point where they made that program no longer important. I think a number of us in the room here are involved, Will included, what's known as the Western Interconnect Regional Electricity Dialogue, where we're looking at market evolution and the possibilities for that in the West. And then ultimately, returning back to fire, grid resilience. We were full in on ESF 12 during the Calder fire as it became the second California wildfire in the state's history to happening this summer that burned over the crest of the Sierra down into the Great Basin. And it was a scary couple of days when 20,000+ people had to be evacuated out of South Lake Tahoe down into Nevada. And so we were there dealing with fuel supply issues, keeping track of that, and then also kind of keeping track of the distribution system. Thankfully, there was very minimal burn into Nevada, but it was great working with California to deal with that. But really kind of exposed and brought to the public's eye investments that are being made when it comes to grid resilience on the part of our investor-owned utility around their infrastructure and the secondary benefits of that, scrubbing the poles, making sure that brush was cleared from the lines, that had an ancillary benefit of being fire breaks had it gone anywhere. So I plant that as excitement that we have about the infrastructure package and the $2.5 billion that was mentioned earlier for formula funding, and we particularly appreciate the statutory language that references wildfire, because that is very much what we're concerned about. So with that, that's my short abbreviated version of hopefully what we're going to hear from everyone else. So this is kind of a show and tell. So, what's been happening? What are you doing on climate? Let's talk about equity. In Nevada, one last little bit, we now have a transportation electrification plan in front of our PUC for $100 million spend on EV charging infrastructure. The legislature very specifically mandated 40% of that spend be to the benefit of LMI communities. So it'll be really interesting to see how that plays out in front of our commission. So that's my piece. Will, what's been going on?
Well, good morning. Will Toor with the Colorado Energy Office. And big picture, I would say very similar dynamics to Nevada, where we're really starting to see the impacts of climate change in a way that really impacts people's everyday lives. And at the same time, we are also seeing sort of unprecedented climate action in the state. Colorado's bad wildfire year was last summer of 2020, where we had the largest wildfires in state history. This year, we're seeing the follow-on impacts of that. So anyone who's traveled through Colorado, Interstate 70, the main east-west connection through the state, goes through beautiful Glenwood Canyon. Glenwood Canyon is one of the places that burned last year, high up on the canyon walls. What we're seeing this year is that every time it rains, we now get mudslides coming down those burned slopes. And we had a period for nearly 2 weeks where the interstate was closed due to mudslides. And at one point, there was a real concern that we could actually lose the interstate because the slides had actually dammed the Colorado River, which was starting to undercut the highway. Those were the sorts of impacts that to really catch people's attention, combined with the approximately 60 days of bad air quality that we had this year, due largely to wildfire smoke coming in from further west. So climate is very much on people's minds. From an action perspective, last January, we released our state greenhouse gas roadmap, which was a strategic plan for how to achieve the goals the legislature had set of 50% reduction by 2030 and 90% reduction by 2050. And then had kind of a wild legislative ride this year that was really all about implementing that roadmap. By my count, 32 pieces of legislation that passed that were related to this. And I think sort of the most interesting pieces are first in those areas that are really amenable to direct regulation, where electric utilities that you can regulate through the PUC, industrial operators that you can regulate through our traditional air regulation. The legislature simply took the targets in the roadmap and made them enforceable. So for utilities, sort of strengthen the requirement that all of our utilities have to achieve at least an 80% reduction in GHG pollution by 2030. In practice, one interesting note is that as we're now moving through the electric resource planning process at the PUC for our largest utility, what we're seeing is that we can probably cost-effectively get north of 90% reduction by 2030, and I think economy-wide, across the utilities, we're likely to significantly exceed that 80% reduction. Put in place requirements for a 60% reduction in pollution from what for us is our second largest source, the oil and gas industry, that is going to require deep reductions in methane emissions from the oil and gas industry, sort of building on earlier work that was done on setting the nation's first methane rules. And then for industry as a whole, outside of oil and gas, our air regulators are required to adopt regulations that will achieve at least a 20% reduction across that sector by 2030, and we're in the throes of rulemaking on that right now. In the areas that are not as amenable to direct regulation, so buildings, one of our 5 largest sectors, ended up having a very robust package of probably 7 different bills that passed on different aspects of that. I would describe them as giving a bunch of tools for building decarbonization, so dramatically expanding our gas utility DSM programs, requiring electric utilities to create new beneficial electrification programs modeled after energy efficiency DSM programs, and setting new building performance standards for large commercial buildings, sort of cribbing from the state of Washington's experience there. And in addition to creating some new financing programs, but tying it all together was a really interesting effort, which was we called the Clean Heat Plan legislation that set essentially binding GHG emissions reduction targets for our gas distribution utilities, and including in their reporting the emissions from combustion of natural gas by their customers. And they are then required to develop clean heat plans that are a technology-neutral approach to meeting those GHG emissions goals. They can use electrification, additional energy efficiency, leak reduction on their system, use of renewable natural gas, or we actually call it recovered methane and don't really use the RNG term because there was so much confusion about it, and use of green hydrogen. And they will submit those plans to the Public Utilities Commission. They have to achieve 22% reduction by 2030, and then the Commission will set future targets that eventually have to get to 90% by 2050. And it was a really interesting process, I have to say. You know, for anyone who's sort of been living in this world of sort of electrification and what's the future of the gas utilities, it can be a really fraught battle, and we've seen just some knockdown, drag-out fights between the gas distribution utilities and organized labor and environmental advocates, and somehow we managed to thread that needle. I think because we took this approach of we're not saying we know the future is 100% electric, we're saying we know that we need to decarbonize the system. We're going to allow you to use whatever tools you want to propose as a utility, but the Public Utilities Commission is going to have to evaluate and make sure that it's actually the most cost-effective, or at least a cost-effective approach to achieving these targets. And it took until the last 2 days of the legislature, but we got everybody on board with that, and amazingly got through the legislature without a single utility or labor union or environmental group opposing the legislation. It was almost kumbaya at the end. So it's going to be very interesting sort of moving forward and sort of learning from that as we start to see our first clean heat plans actually developed and considered by the PUC. And then finally, I would say on transportation, clearly another one of the really challenging sectors. We had a number of things that I think are really interesting that move forward. One was a major new sustainable funding source for investment in transportation electrification. Our legislature passed new fees on residential deliveries, so think Amazon, FedEx, UPS, and a new fee on transportation network companies, think Uber and Lyft. The Uber Lyft fee actually depends on whether you're in an electric vehicle or an internal combustion engine. So there's one fee for single occupant trips in an internal combustion engine, lower fee if it's either multi-passenger trip or electric vehicle. Collectively, these will grow over time. It'll generate just under $1 billion over the next decade. That's going to 3 new transportation electrification enterprises, one focused on EV fueling and hydrogen fueling infrastructure, one focused on public transit electrification, and one supporting fleet incentives for both public fleets, medium heavy-duty trucks, school buses, and transportation network company fleets. So we're going to have some real investment to make in building out that infrastructure and those programs. Going along with that, we had our first utility transportation electrification plan, $105 million. Also with although yours is larger by capita, I've been watching. Yours is going to be the largest per capita in the country, I think. Also with a significant equity component, including direct rebates to low-income customers for purchasing either used or new electric vehicles. And then the other really interesting element, last thing I'd say on transportation, is the legislature gave direction to our Department of Transportation that reducing greenhouse gas emissions and helping to achieve the state's GHG targets is a key requirement for the planning process for both them and our state's metropolitan planning organizations. And so we're now in the middle of a rulemaking at our Transportation Commission to set greenhouse gas budgets for the transportation system, and transportation plans, again, either the regional plans or the state plan, will have to show that they can meet those budgets in order to be able to be approved and spend state money on transportation investments. That's also a sort of fascinating and fraught process that will be playing out over the next 2 months. We anticipate it being approved in the December timeframe. So that's our quick.
Thanks, Will. Jason, not a whole lot going on climate-wise in Louisiana, right?
Not at all, David, not at all. So I'll start just a little bit. I think the remarks this morning were very fitting in the sense of I kind of felt like I was at a briefing with our governor, and some of the stuff that we talk about in Louisiana there are a lot of similarities with Maine. And when we talk about living and working on the coast, those are interesting dynamics that we live every day in Louisiana, and that's what makes energy so challenging. And I'll talk just a little bit about that and why I think it's so important, and then talk about kind of what we're doing on climate. So Louisiana has very much a working coast, and what I mean by that is that 60 to 70% of our population lives and works on the coast. So energy is a critical part of what we do on the coast. Coastal Louisiana has a lot of refining capacity, a lot of oil and gas activity, a lot of things happening every day to make sure that the energy needs and demands are met across the country. So when you do that, we're faced with climate challenges every day, and I had just the distinct privilege to work for our governor in the coastal agency for a number of years and see that land loss and see those changes firsthand. And what I mean by that is that these barrier islands in coastal Louisiana, the wetlands that have protected us for so many years are rapidly disappearing. So when you look at 2,000 square miles of land that's been lost in coastal Louisiana over the last 50 years, we're talking about state-sized land, Rhode Island-type land loss that's happened over the states in a very short period of time. So in 2003, our governor, our legislators got together and formed an agency after Hurricane Katrina, really to bring those things to the forefront. And that was really where I think that the climate discussion and the climate focus really came to fruition, because before you had agencies that were operating separately, where one was doing restoration, small restoration projects mostly done through the QIPRA program, and then you had another agency that was doing flood protection. And flood protection is so important to us because we have a lot of residents that live very close to the coastline, so levees, bridges, all these things have to work together, transportation. But there wasn't a coordinated effort or agency that brought all of that together. So 2005, there's been a tremendous amount that's been done to just bring a lot of that to the forefront, to build a hurricane protection system in the city of New Orleans, a $3 billion hurricane protection system that's up to 100-year flood level protection. That system, as you probably saw in the news, performed very well during Hurricane Ida. Talking about what's going on, we've had 5 named storms in 2020 that caused billions of dollars of damage. Lake Charles in West Louisiana alone had a major Category 4 storm and then had another one hit shortly after. So those communities today, if you fly over them or travel through them, are still recovering every day. And I say that just because that 5 named storms in a year is almost unprecedented. And when you have impacts from a storm and have another one right behind it, it's very difficult to keep going back and to talk to residents and just to hear the stories where they put a new roof on their house and then they have to do it again in 3 months after that. So Ida was another big hit this year. We had probably, I think, millions of power outages for probably close to 2 weeks. We still have folks that are still, just the whole community has changed. So we are trying very hard to incorporate energy into our overall planning for climate. And I will tell you that our governor, Governor Edwards, has been very proactive in bringing many different people to the table. And he formed by executive order a year and a half ago called a Climate Initiatives Task Force, which brings every state cabinet secretary together on a task force to talk specifically and to work towards solutions on climate. And we have progressed very well. I think that what we have seen, even with COVID through Zoom, is that folks are starting to talk about it. I think years ago, it was not something in Louisiana that we talked about a lot just because energy was so dominant. But I think folks are starting to take a step back and say that, hey, these two things need to work together. Climate and energy, population, all these different things are related. So we have to look at them holistically. And that task force has really been very beneficial to a lot of different people to start to look at the big picture. And I think that when you work in government, many times we think about things in very legislative and fiscal cycles. We talk about funding, so it's a 2-year or a 4-year outlook. Taking a step back and looking at a climate task force that's tasked with taking that very distant approach. We're trying to do that from the coastal standpoint. We're trying to do it from an energy standpoint with our comprehensive energy plans. And that's really helped to kind of frame the conversation that you can go out and talk to residents and kind of explain to them, this is the time for us to pivot. This is the time to look towards energy to say that we need to do things that are innovative. We need to bring industry to the table as opposed to just doing it through regulation and have those conversations with them. And we're finding that they're very open and want to work with us to look for solutions. And for us, when we look at energy sources, we're blessed with abundant resources of natural gas and lots of other energy sources. And these folks are coming to us to say that we want to look for solutions to make these things burn cleaner, more environmentally sustainable, and work with those communities through outreach and engagement programs to make sure that they understand that these investments have a very long-term effect for these communities. And I think that for us, that's probably been the most important thing that we've tried to do, is that when projects are announced or when we have a new innovative program that comes to us through the Energy Office, it's going in and trying to talk to the communities and the stakeholders, starting at the residence level with the legislator, and really trying to explain to them what that impact is going to have or what that project impact will have from a positive standpoint. So with that, I will talk a little bit more just about energy in general. I think that for us and for climate, our governor is going to be attending COP26 and really talking about this race to zero and how important it is to work with other states and really look at that long-term planning and trying to make sure that everybody is rowing in the same direction. And I think that the most rewarding thing for us on the climate side is being able to talk to other agencies to know that if we do something, they're looking at things through the same lens. So I think that that's been just a very, very good thing for us, because if transportation does something on climate, or if they're trying to do things from an electric vehicle or our clean fuels program's doing something, it's important that the energy side is doing those things as well. So I think that for us, mostly what we've been trying to do is to try to make sure that, number one, we're putting forth actions that are attainable, not just putting goals out there that we can't meet. And one of the challenges, and one of the things that Dan brought up this morning when he was talking about CO2 emissions, so 50% of Maine's is transportation, their carbon dioxide emissions. You look at Texas, you look at Louisiana, we have the highest industrial emissions in the United States. And just to give you a flavor for what that is, 60% of our emissions are industrial. So 220 million metric tons per year. We're the 5th largest CO2 emitter in the United States, and a lot of that is because we have industrial corridors in Louisiana that are making products that we use every day, but they're also very CO2 intensive. So for us, trying to get them to the table to look at long-term solutions for fertilizer plants, steel, those hard to decarbonize industries, it's important and imperative that they're at the table to make sure that they're looking towards solutions that we can actually implement. And when we say that, I think that you take a step back and you say that all these solutions that we're talking about, carbon capture, hydrogen, all these new innovative things have to be looked at together. And what I mean by that is that you can't have one without the other. Solar has to work with hydrogen, blue hydrogen, green hydrogen have to work with CCUS. All those things have to be done together for us to meet these long-term emission goals, which for us, we're trying to go neutral by 2050. And when you look at the industrial emissions, that's a challenge because some of these industries have very pure stream sources and some of them have very not pure stream sources, which make the cost of capturing that carbon very, very different. You may have an industry that has 100% pure stream that with 45Q incentive, you can capture it for $50 a ton, and you have a steel plant that may take $180 per ton. So it's trying to work towards solutions that are in the middle ground to bring everybody to the table. So the federal government obviously has been extremely supportive of climate and trying to make sure that we have a program that we can bring to the table just from an incentive standpoint to make sure that companies are planning for that long term. So we've been very proactive in trying to work with our regulators and trying to make sure that we have plans and we have the program and the staff to be able to implement permits. Because at the end of the day, what we hear from companies every single day is they need certainty. They want to know how long a permit's going to take. They want to make sure that our office supports those objectives. And again, they want to make sure that everybody is rowing in the same direction. So what I'll leave you with today on climate is that I think that we're very positive and we're very enthusiastic about where we're going. And the reception that we've gotten from a lot of the folks who we've been working with in every phase of the community is that they see this as something that's critical to be able to survive in the long term. And I think that for us, that pivot point is now. It used to be with energy, it's like we're going to proceed down the same path because that's how we know how to do it. Now we're starting to see that folks are saying that we need to look past that and say that for these industries to be around, we need to start to look at how do we do this in a more holistic, to bring all these different things together, all these different technologies. And there's some, and with all that being said, there's some significant challenges by doing that. And I'll share just a few of those with you. When we talk about solar development, what we're finding now, our office has been very involved with trying to put out guidelines, trying to work with communities we have a lot of rural parishes in Louisiana that really don't have a handle on what a solar development looks like, what do they need to look for, what do setback distances look like. And so it's intimidating for them when a developer comes in and they want to procure land. So there have often been a lot of different things that have happened where the land use aspect comes, or energy density is a term that we're hearing more and more about, where farmers and landowners and others don't want solar developments because they think that it's taking a lot of the available farmland. Developers, we have to go in and say that, guys, look, in the big picture, these things can work together, that we're not going to displace, we're not taking one for the other. Let's figure out ways to work together and to try to make sure that, we can come up with solutions to where clean energy and our way of life that we're doing right now can make sense. So again, I'll talk forever about it because there's a lot to be said, but one of the things that I think that is so important about this week and what we're here, just the little bit of time that we've been here, and even yesterday evening, being able to sit around the table with other states. We've all done that on Zoom for, I think, an extended period of time, which has been fantastic, but to be able to hear about similarities, to be able to hear about challenges, and to see and live and breathe what other states are doing to kind of help frame that, hey, we're not just doing this alone, that other folks are facing those same challenges. That's always an effective mechanism for us to go back and say, okay, there are other people who are going through this. Let's tap on that expertise. I know that personally I've called Dan numerous times on offshore wind because we have a huge initiative on that to help with our climate plan. So again, that spirit of collaboration with folks who are here is always super important. So can't stress that enough. So thanks so much.
Here, here. Thank you, Jason. And certainly, since we've last been together, the pandemic has been the big story, but I think the other big story is, as Governor Mills referenced this morning, just all of the climate-induced weather events that we've had. And I know that so many of our states have had those experiences, but when I think about those, I think about Louisiana very much at the top of that. And it's just amazing the very real suffering and human experience that has happened. And so all of our best to Louisiana and your work. Yeah, here's to sharing and moving forward. John, how's it going?
Good. Nothing like New York and sharing. But I think the one thing, actually, I think I was going to, the talk about collaboration and, being together in a room, I mean, I think this really is very kind of heartening, and it is always great to be kind of in the exchange space. I think one challenge, I mean, I don't know if it's going to be a challenge for David or if it's going to be a challenge for all of us. I mean, I think we do like to have our points of contact, and we do make our collaborations based on our own priorities and where our timing is, and that's, that certainly does play a strong factor there. I'm going to go into a little bit what we're in the middle of in New York, but honestly, the message in New York is becoming ever stronger that our success in our own kind of climate and clean energy space depends on everybody's success, right? We are not going to do it on our own in New York. That might be a first anybody's ever said that.
Took a while for you to come to that realization, but we appreciate you're here.
But so the idea of us like really needing to come together and formulate how we are going to be creating these new national markets, I think, is the new imperative. Because we can, move forward with our own state-based plans. We can move forward with a lot of our own internal state constituents, and I don't discount the need to do any of that. But I do think we need to kind of get out of our own boxes a little bit and make sure that as we are working internally, that we are doing it in a way that is understanding where the rest of the country is really going. And I think that that is going to be the real foundation for success for all of us in our in-state activity. So making the markets is what I'm going to sort of use as maybe as one message coming out of this. But be that as it may, so we're making markets in New York. I won't go into them. Our biggest activity in New York over the past year has really been a big planning activity. And our traditional energy plan has probably been eclipsed by our climate action plan process. We have a 22-member Climate Action Council. It's 12 commissioners of all disciplines across the state, and then 10 appointees from various disciplines, all helping to inform how the state can be looking at both kind of near, mid, long-term emission reduction strategies. And on top of that council forming to pull together what we're calling our scoping plan, which will be due at the end of this year, it's just a draft. We'll also then have a year of engagement with various stakeholders over 2022 to make sure that that plan is finally informed and with a final kind of roadmap and plan at the end of next year. But that engagement has not been put off until 2022. We actually created 8 what we called advisory panels, as well as 2 separate working groups, all of various disciplined interests, whether it was industry, environmental, justice, other interests in sector-based groups, all negotiating and discussing, deliberating, coming up with recommendations within that sector's sort of emission reduction potential, and advancing those to the Climate Council for consideration in our draft. It was a very highly deliberative, negotiated process, and really a lot of great minds coming together and trying to coalesce around recommendations. We're currently at a point where those recommendations have helped to inform some analysis work that we're just about in the middle of. Tomorrow is a big reveal day, so pardon me if I'm not around for every presentation tomorrow. We actually have decided to approach with 3 different visions of how New York could move forward. And we are looking at it from an environmental perspective and what are the nature of the technology types, the rate of adoption in the marketplace that can be assumed, and making sure that we are meeting our statutory requirements of 40% emission reduction by 2030, 85% by 2050. And what is the interplay across sectors in terms of the various technologies and speeds of adoption that we can be looking at to create those different scenarios for people to understand and deliberate over. Our emission scenarios were released a couple of weeks ago. Tomorrow we will be coming forward with our benefit cost analysis, which a lot of folks are very interested in seeing. So that is really where we're kind of at. The council will take all of this information, come to the table with their own other discussions. What we will be doing is moving forward with that draft plan by the end of the year. Now, the one wrinkle I'll put on, and maybe it's not a wrinkle, but I will say what we're doing maybe a little bit new in New York is that we've actually changed our, what I'm going to call climate or carbon accounting methodology, right? And in the past, New York has utilized very standard IPCC-based assumptions and methods for looking at different gas impacts, looking at different technology conversion factors. We've gone a bit of a different direction in New York. And what we've done is adopt a number of different changes. One is we have adopted a 20-year global warming potential across the board. That changes the look of things. We've also are accounting for end-use emission effects of biofuels. So we don't just assume it's a net-net across the life of those fuels. And we are also taking account of what we're calling upstream emissions, right? So to the degree that, we do kind of import a lot of fuel into New York, there is an emission stream associated with the production and the transport getting it to New York, not just for the end-use burn. In doing that, that really has kind of changed our emissions profile really quite profoundly. We were kind of a transportation majority emissions state. We do now see that our buildings and transportation sector are virtually equal. That is the result of, looking at the impact of natural gas, very differently in New York as we would have previously thought about it. And the other thing that, has happened as a result of this new accounting approach is that it makes the challenge really that much more difficult, right? It makes it more difficult in terms of the volume of emissions we're now looking at, right? In our old accounting approach, New York had somewhere around 200 million metric tons to address from our base level. That went up to 375. It also accelerates in what it means to find the emission reductions needed. So our 2030 emission reduction challenge is really quite more assertive than what it had been previously. So it does have us thinking about, like, how do we really start to stand up, again, very quickly, making those markets for the alternatives, making sure that we have all of the supply chains put into place, how are consumers coming to these new markets. All of that will start becoming the new challenge as we see it in New York. I would say that it does offer opportunity space, right? And so we are thinking about new technology innovations. We're looking at the potential for how does hydrogen fit into some of those hard to decarbonize spaces. But certainly electrification is the way that we're going, and it's a very rapid pace of electrification that we'll be seeing, and look forward to working with you all to try to move that. I'll leave it there.
Thank you, John. And I find that, amongst all the commonalities that we have, I think this question of gas and the future of gas certainly is playing out in different ways across our various states. But I also think it's very interesting to watch how equity weaves through that. I mean, John, you talk about making markets, you talk about bringing consumers to the table. Certainly there's an equity component to that. Jason, the industrial aspects and the importance of that sector to your economies in Louisiana as that relates to gas, that's very important. And Will, it's really interesting to hear about the heat standard and the agnosticism behind that. And I was just amazed to hear your report that in the end that got through the legislature seemingly very cleanly, which is nice. And going back to our legislative session that we had in Nevada, I would say that equity and environmental justice kind of took some interesting shifts when it came to people coming to the table around this topic of the future of gas. We had a bill that was not ultimately successful that set some step-down targets for direct use of gas, as well as mandated basically integrated resource planning for direct use of gas, and didn't go anywhere. But in response, our commission has opened up an investigatory docket looking at gas. And in that conversation, the labor perspectives, the senior advocate perspectives, restaurant owners, et cetera, obviously were very engaged in the topic and had a lot of perspectives to offer. So I'll start with you, but I think others can weigh in on this. Is how did equity fit into that discussion with your heat standard?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And, I would say, I think as probably everybody is seeing, equity is really sort of rising up in the public debate on all of these issues as we have sort of the broader reckoning society-wide around racial and economic justice. And we have a lot that's been moving that's sort of around procedural justice and ensuring that those voices are formally invited in ways that will be effective for their communities into the process. But when it comes to particular issues, there are so many, and sort of how it plays out, there are so many different threads to it and sort of differences in opinion in sort of what does justice actually mean in that context. So in the context of the clean heat plans, we have one set of environmental justice advocates who very much believe that the natural gas system should just be wound down right away, that they're concerned about indoor air quality from use of gas within homes. They're concerned about sort of impacts on the communities near the extraction. We had another set of folks who were very concerned about cost impacts on ratepayers, and what does it mean for, as you said, for seniors, for low-income residents to potentially have significant cost increases associated with new trajectories on heating. And there's some real issues there. And as we've looked at it, we are quite concerned about the potential that as we move to higher levels of electrification, that if we're not careful, we're going to still have all of the same fixed costs on the gas distribution system and a smaller and smaller number of likely skewing to low-income customers having to absorb those fixed costs if we don't manage this very carefully. And then there was a labor perspective where there's a lot of unionized jobs in, for groups like the pipe fitters really didn't want to see those go away. And so, negotiating sort of all of those interests was really sort of how we ended up with the structure that we adopted, where we set the carbon targets and then are going to allow a much more detailed planning process for each utility that will then play out at the Public Utilities Commission to really sort of try to just sort of get going, start learning by doing. As we look over the next decade and sort of getting to, that 22% reduction by 2030, it's pretty clear that we can do that without sort of major negative impacts on anyone. But in the process of doing that, we're going to learn what's it like to actually try to do large-scale electrification. Can recovered methane actually play a significant role? Is there really a role for hydrogen in the gas distribution system? There are many people who passionately believe they know the answer to every one of those questions, and they all have very different answers. And so our sense is that we know that we need to get going on deploying these things. We know electrification will be a big part of the solution. We don't know if it'll be all of the solution. And we're going to learn a ton over the next 4 or 5 years as the first planning periods play out. And then I think we will have to confront sort of these big questions as we start developing the next plans for post-2030.
Anybody else want to weigh in?
I'll just, taking a little bit on how we're thinking about equity at NYSERDA specifically, maybe not necessarily from a state perspective or from any particular sort of engagement type of perspective. But, we have really tried to integrate, what it means to be a diverse, equitable, and inclusive organization. And I think we're feeling that, the way that we feel like we can be influential in helping kind of equity and inclusive outcomes in our clean energy system is by ensuring that we are ourselves a diverse, equitable, and inclusive institution. So we have just completed our own kind of strategic plan on how we are going to be integrating diversity into NYSERDA, and that means a number of different things, right? We've actually incorporated diversity as part of our kind of institutional mission now. And so we're not kind of just thinking about equity, and equity outcomes in clean energy through thinking like, what does it look like at the other end? but how does every single part of our process really take account of what we might need to institutionally change, or how do we think about what the equitable outcome is as we're thinking about like sort of all of our operations. And we've come up with it's a 4 kind of point plan. Looking at, a bunch of it is, how do we think about our own kind of procurement process and building equity into that. Certainly we think about kind of our own kind of construct and makeup of what NYSERDA as an organization looks like itself. We want to keep ourselves accountable, but then like one of our equivalent missions is also how do we become an agent for change in our clean energy industry as well. And so thinking about, what are the different nature of the industries that we're working in, and how do we kind of influence all of our industry partners to better integrate equity and diverse outcomes in their own operations. And I think through that kind of outward-facing kind of activity is where we'll see perhaps the most change. But I think we feel like if we're not doing it ourselves at NYSERDA, then it's hard for us to make sure that we're able to influence our partners.
Oh, that's very important at an institutional level. I think we have time for a couple questions from the audience, if anyone would like to step up and ask a question. We see one back there. Do we have a NASEO staffer who can help with the mic? Yes.
Good morning. Michelle, Minnesota. And thank you for this panel. I am wondering, with the various climate plans that you're doing, what level of formal tribal consultation you are doing in your states to incorporate all the voices of those that share the same geographic borders that you do.
Michelle, I'll start. So part of that group, even with the cabinet secretaries in terms of folks who are on the climate task force, there's a specific one, Chief Sherelle Dardar, who leads our tribal focus for the state and for the governor, is on the task force. So she has been involved from day one, and I think is really responsible for taking the action plans that are developed and vetting them through her communities and making sure that folks are aware and understand what each one of those impacts are. We have a lot of those folks who live and work on the coast, who work in the seafood communities and others. So again, she is integrally involved in terms of trying to make sure that that message is getting out in terms of what the state's plan looks like, and is making recommendations on each one of those action plans to ensure that folks are aware of what it looks like.
And I'll just provide a quick Nevada perspective. I think the answer is to this important question, not enough just yet on the climate front. Our own plans initially were to, as I mentioned at the outset, have as many, meet folks where they are at in-person type meetings, and we definitely had to pull back from that. And I think as a result, certainly our tribal engagement and our intentions suffered for that. We were successful, for instance, in having a Spanish language opportunity, but we did not, we were not able to schedule really sort of face-to-face with tribal nations in Nevada. Looking forward, our opportunity next, though, is that coming out of the last session, we now have constructed what's called the Regional Transmission Coordination Task Force, which is not, it's kind of about transmission, but it's ultimately about having a conversation about Nevada's future place in a possible organized electricity market in the West. And so there is specifically a tribal appointment to that commission, and I had a conversation just 2 days ago with our governor's office about who we're going to bring into that, because there's such incredible diversity in Nevada amongst the nations in terms of how they are potentially impacted by various energy plans, be they transmission, be they energy sufficiency. We have a number of tribes that have moved forward with their own solar projects, for instance. And so we have to really kind of think this one through. We have a Nevada Indian Commission. The executive director of that organization is a cabinet member. So we actually have a lot of regular coordination with her right now on energy issues. It may end up being her. probably shouldn't say this in a public forum, or, you know, I think we're looking for who is a representative of a nation that has sort of, you know, direct experience, direct nexus with some of the topics that we're going to be talking about, knowing that the shortcoming would be that that person may not necessarily be able to speak for everyone, nor should they be expected to. So it's a very important question. I certainly know in Minnesota it's very important, and we all have a different version of that in all of our states. And so thank you for that. And with that, time's up. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you to our panelists.